Ambrose Ketter didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of the Copper Hollow land office like he owned it, which, in every way that mattered, he did, and dropped a folded document onto the clerk's desk, hard enough to rattle the ink bottles. "Record it," he said. "Red Willow's mortgage. I bought it from the bank this morning." The clerk looked up, his face going pale. "Mrs. Danner's place?" Not for long. Ketter straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and walked back out into the cold Montana morning without another word. He didn't need to say more. In Copper Hollow, when Ambrose Ketter bought your debt, the conversation was already over. He just hadn't met Rosalie Danner yet. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to our channel and hit the like button so you never miss what happens next. Stories like this one come out every week, and they only get better. Drop a comment and tell us the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all truly began. The Copper Hollow horse auction was held on the second Saturday of every month, rain or shine, freeze or thaw, and on this particular October morning in 1888, the freeze was winning. Rosalie Danner arrived before most of the bidders, which was her habit. She came early, because early meant she could walk the pens without men trying to explain things to her, could press her palms against the shoulders of horses she was considering, and could make up her own mind before anyone had the chance to make it up for her. She had driven herself in from Red Willow 12 miles of rutted road that turned brutal after the first hard frost, with June bundled beside her on the buckboard seat, the 9-year-old's nose buried inside her coat collar and her dark eyes scanning everything with the same quiet alertness she'd inherited from her mother. "That one's lame," June said, pointing toward a roan mare tied near the front gate. Rosalie glanced at the mare without slowing the wagon. "Left rear, I saw it too. Will somebody still buy her?" "Somebody always does." Rosalie set the brake and climbed down, then lifted her arms for June, who dropped into them without hesitation, even though she was old enough to have managed the step herself. Old habits. Rosalie didn't mind. "Stay close and don't touch anything I haven't looked at first." The auction yard smelled the way all auction yards smelled: manure and sawdust, and the particular animal tension of creatures who didn't know what was happening to them or where they'd end up by nightfall. Rosalie had been coming here for 3 years, ever since Thomas died and left her with a ranch and a child and a set of account books that had taken her 6 weeks to fully understand. She understood them now. She understood them better than Thomas ever had, and what she understood was that Red Willow was bleeding out 1 month at a time. She needed horses she could resell at a profit or work into a breeding line. She needed them cheap enough that the margin left her something to breathe with. And she needed them sound, because she couldn't afford to carry animals that couldn't earn their keep. What she found in the far pen, separated from the main auction stock by 2 fence rails and a hand-lettered sign that read "Caution Not Broke," was not what she'd been looking for. The black stallion stood against the back rail, with his head up and his ears pinned, watching everything that moved with the focused intensity of an animal that had learned to trust nothing that walked on 2 legs. He was bigger than anything else in the yard, with the kind of deep chest and clean legs that made experienced horsemen stop and stare before they remembered to pretend they hadn't noticed. Someone had worked him hard and not kindly. The evidence was there in the scars along his neck and the way he held himself, coiled and watchful, like a man who'd been hit enough times to know the next blow was always coming. "Mama." June's voice was different, quieter. She was gripping Rosalie's hand with both of hers, and she wasn't looking at Rosalie, she was looking at the stallion. "I see him. He's scared. He's dangerous," Rosalie said. Which isn't the same thing, but right now both of them are true. The man beside the stallion was the other thing worth noticing. He was younger than the age his face suggested, maybe 32, 33, with the lean, deliberate build of someone who had spent most of his adult life working outdoors and not eating particularly well. His boots were worn through at the right heel. His coat was a size too large and had been mended at the shoulder with a slightly different thread. He wasn't watching the crowd the way a seller usually watched a crowd, sizing up bidders and calculating who could afford what. He was watching the stallion, tracking every shift in the animal's weight, with the focused attention of someone who was already thinking 3 moves ahead. When the stallion tossed his head and crowded toward the rail, the man moved. Not fast, there was nothing panicked in it, but with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided exactly where he was going to be before the horse decided to go there. He put one hand low on the stallion's neck. He said something Rosalie couldn't hear from 20 feet away. The stallion's ears shifted, not calm, not tame, but something. Rosalie studied them for another moment, then made a decision she didn't entirely explain to herself. She walked over. The man noticed her coming but didn't turn until she was at the rail. He had gray eyes, the kind that looked like they'd been weathered to that color rather than born to it, and a jaw that needed a razor's attention about 2 days ago. "He's yours?" she asked. "For now." "What does that mean?" "Means I'm selling him." He didn't elaborate. Rosalie looked at the stallion. Up close, the quality was even more obvious, and so was the damage. Both of them together told a story she'd heard before in different forms. "What are you asking, $20? She looked at him. "For that horse." "Yes, ma'am. That horse is worth $200 if he's handled right." "I know what he's worth." Something shifted briefly behind those gray eyes. "Problem is I'm the only one who can handle him, and $20 is what I need." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. She was doing math she didn't put into words, not the arithmetic kind, but the other kind. The kind where you stacked a man's worn boots against the steadiness of his hands, and the way an uncontrollable animal had just shifted under his touch, and you tried to figure out what the sum of all of it actually was. "You got work?" she asked. "Not currently. You know horses." "Some." She almost smiled at that. Men who said some when they meant considerably were either lying or so accustomed to understatement that they'd stopped noticing the difference. In her experience, the second kind was usually more useful than the first. $20 for the horse, she said. $40 if the cowboy comes with him. She said it loud enough that the two men leaning on the fence nearby heard it, and one of them laughed outright and nudged the other. The man with the gray eyes didn't laugh. He tilted his head very slightly and looked at her the way people look at a hand of cards they hadn't expected to be dealt. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about money." She held out her hand. "Rosalie Danner, Red Willow Ranch, 12 miles east. I need a hired hand who can work horses, and you need $20 more than you're currently asking for." He looked at her hand for a moment. "Gideon Rusk." He shook it. His grip was firm without performing anything. "Rusk." She filed it away. "Is there a reason you're selling a horse worth 10 times what you're asking?" "I need to leave town quickly," he said, "and he won't load for anyone but me, which means I can't leave him behind." "You're in some kind of trouble?" "Not the kind you're thinking." She studied him for a beat longer than was strictly polite. He held her look without flinching, which was either confidence or practice, and she wasn't yet sure which. "All right, Gideon Rusk," she said. $40, 3 meals a day, and a bunk in the hired hand's quarters. You work horses, you fix fence, and you do what I tell you when I tell you without argument. Trial period of 30 days. After that, we renegotiate if we're both still standing. "Those are reasonable terms," he said. "They're my terms." Reasonable isn't the point. That almost got a reaction from him, not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. He looked back at the stallion. He'll need a separate pen for the first few weeks. Something solid, not just rail fence. He'll go through a rail fence. "I have a stone corral, that'll do." The men on the rail fence had stopped laughing. One of them had moved off to find someone else to tell. Rosalie was aware of being watched from the other side of the auction yard before she turned around to confirm it. In a town this size, you developed a sense for that particular quality of attention, the kind that wasn't curious but calculating. Ambrose Ketter stood 40 feet away, with 2 of his riders flanking him at a comfortable remove, the way powerful men kept company when they wanted to suggest they had no need of it. He was older than Gideon by 20 years, thick through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man who had once done hard work and now merely observed it. His hat was better than anyone else's in the yard. His boots hadn't seen rough ground recently. He was looking at Gideon Rusk with an expression Rosalie couldn't entirely read. Not recognition, or if it was recognition, he was suppressing it hard. Something passed across Ketter's face, quick and controlled, and then it was gone. He turned and said something to one of his riders. Rosalie tucked that away and turned back to the transaction at hand. "Can you drive a wagon?" she asked Gideon. "Yes." "Then load your horse and let's go. Auction's not going to give me anything I can afford today anyway." Gideon looked once more across the yard. Whether he'd seen Ketter, she couldn't tell. His expression gave her nothing either way. "Give me 10 minutes with the loading." "Take 15, she said. "I need to settle the fee with the auctioneer and get June something warm to eat before we start back." "June?" "My daughter." She nodded toward where June was standing at the next pen over, studying a bay gelding with her arms folded, and her head tilted in a posture that was, Rosalie recognized with a start, almost exactly how she herself had been standing 3 minutes ago. "She's 9. She's not in the way." Gideon glanced at June. June looked back at him with the direct, unimpressed assessment of a child who had decided to form her own opinions about things. "She's studying that gelding pretty hard for someone who's not in the way," he said. "She's studying everything. It's her primary occupation." Rosalie was already moving. 15 minutes, Mr. Rusk. Don't make me come back for you." The ride out to Red Willow took almost 2 hours on account of Gideon leading the stallion on a long line behind the wagon for the first mile, until the animal settled enough to be convinced that the wagon wasn't going to eat him. June sat between them on the seat, which had not exactly been the plan, but she had installed herself there with the quiet determination of a child who understood that nobody was going to physically remove her, and Rosalie had decided it wasn't the hill to die on. The stallion, she noticed, seemed to settle faster when Gideon's voice was in range. He talked to the horse in a low, unhurried way that wasn't quite words and wasn't quite not words, just a steady presence of sound that the animal could track through the noise and motion of an unfamiliar road. "What's his name?" June asked, about halfway home. "The horse?" "Midnight Jack." June considered this. "That's a good name." "He named himself," Gideon said. "Took 3 of us to catch him the first time, and it was past midnight when we finally did." "Where did you catch him?" "Up north. He'd been running loose for 2 seasons. Nobody could get close to him. But you could, eventually." June pulled this over. "How?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. The road curved around a stand of cottonwoods, and the wind came at them from a different direction, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere ahead. "I stopped trying to catch him," he said. "I just stayed near him. Day after day. Not crowding, not chasing, just there." June thought about this for long enough that Rosalie thought the conversation was finished. "Like how you make friends," June said. Gideon glanced at her. "Something like that. Mama does that," June said thoughtfully. "She doesn't try to make people like her. She just stays near them and does good work until they forget they didn't trust her." There was a brief silence. Rosalie kept her eyes on the road ahead and said nothing. "Smart woman, your mother," Gideon said. "She's the smartest person I know," June said, without a trace of flattery in it, just the declarative certainty of someone reporting a fact. "But don't tell her I said that. She'll say I'm biased." "You are biased," Rosalie said. "I know," June said. "Doesn't make it wrong." Red Willow Ranch appeared through the cottonwoods at the bottom of the long slope, the main house, the barn, the stone corral that had been there before Thomas's grandfather built anything else. The 2 outbuildings, the fence lines running out toward the creek. From a distance, it looked solid. From closer, the details told a different story. Fence posts that needed replacing, a gap in the barn roof where a board had come loose in the last windstorm, the garden gone to frost and not yet cleared. Gideon didn't say anything about any of it, but Rosalie caught the brief, methodical way his eyes moved across the property as they came down the slope. He was cataloging. She recognized it, because she did the same thing every morning when she stepped off the porch. 2 of her hired hands, Cully and Pete, were at the barn when they pulled in. Cully was younger, red-headed, and possessed of an opinion about everything. Pete was older, quieter, and had been with Red Willow since before Thomas died. They both looked at the wagon, then at the black stallion behind it, then at Gideon on the seat. "Mrs. Danner," Cully said carefully, "is that stallion what I think it is?" "That depends on what you think it is. Something that's going to eat Pete." "Nobody's eating Pete," Rosalie said, climbing down. "This is Gideon Rusk. He'll be working horses and general repair. The stallion is his. He goes in the stone corral until further notice." Cully and Pete exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. "Welcome," Pete said to Gideon, with the particular flatness of a man who was reserving actual welcome for later. Gideon climbed down and went immediately to the stallion, not ignoring the men but making clear by his movement that the horse came first. He put his hand on the animal's neck, said something low, and the stallion dropped his head about 2 inches, barely anything. But Pete noticed. Because Pete looked at horses the way some men looked at weather. He's handled animals before, Pete said quietly to Rosalie, as if this were private information. Why do you think I hired him? She left them to the logistics of the stone corral and went inside to start supper, because it was the end of October and the days were short and cold, and there was still bookwork to do after June was in bed. And Rosalie Danner had not survived 3 years alone by failing to account for every hour of a day. She was 6 pages into the account ledger when she heard a knock at the back door, not the front which visitors used, but the back which was the ranch hand's approach when they needed the house. She opened it to find Gideon, hat off, standing on the step in the cold. What is it? She asked, the fence along the east pasture. 3 sections need replacing, not just repair. If you've got the post lumber, I can start on it Monday. I know about the east pasture fence, I figured. I'm telling you, because you should know it's worse than it looks from the road. Somebody's been cutting the bottom wire and bending it back. Not weather damage. She looked at him. You're sure? Yes, ma'am. She was quiet for a moment. I'm aware that it might not be accidental. He didn't ask her what she meant by that, or push her to elaborate, which meant either he wasn't curious, or he understood that she'd told him exactly as much as she intended to. Monday, then, she said. Yes, ma'am. He put his hat back on and stepped off the porch. Mr. Rusk, she said. He stopped. I don't know what you're running from, and I'm not asking you to tell me. She held the door half open against the cold, and the lamplight from the kitchen made a warm line across the step where he was standing. But I run a straight operation here. If you have business that's going to bring trouble to my door, I need to know about it before it arrives, not after. Gideon turned and looked at her for a moment. The cold had put a little color into his face, and he was steady in the way of someone who had been asked harder questions than this and survived them. The trouble I have isn't going to follow me here, he said. How do you know? Because the man it involves doesn't know where I am. A beat. Yet, she let that land and stayed with it. All right, she said. Good night, Mr. Rusk. Good night, Mrs. Danner. She shut the door and stood in her kitchen for a moment, with her hand still on the latch, listening to his boots cross the frozen ground toward the bunkhouse. Yet, she thought. He'd said yet. She went back to the ledger. The first week passed, with the specific texture of early winter ranch work, long and cold and full of small problems that required large amounts of time and effort to solve. Gideon arrived at the barn before Cully and Pete both mornings, which Cully noted with a combination of resentment and grudging respect. He didn't talk much. He didn't offer opinions on how things were being done, unless Rosalie asked, and when Shishi's asked, his answers were direct and stripped of unnecessary detail. He fixed the east fence, all 3 sections, in a day and a half. He found the source of the irrigation channel blockage that had been reducing water pressure to the upper pasture for 2 months and cleared it in an afternoon. He didn't ask for tools he hadn't been offered. He improvised. He made do. Rosalie watched all of this from a careful distance, the way she watched everything on her property, and she filed it away. The problem was June. Not that June was a problem. June was never a problem in the way that required intervention. The problem was that June had decided Gideon was interesting, and a 9-year-old who had decided something was interesting was about as stoppable as weather. By the 3rd day, she was following him to the stone corral in the mornings. By the 4th day, she was sitting on the top rail while he worked with Midnight Jack. By the 5th day, she had graduated to standing inside the corral at the far end, very still, while Gideon moved the stallion in slow circles around her. Rosalie had watched this through the barn window for 10 minutes before she made herself stop watching and go back to work. Is that safe? She asked Gideon. That evening, at the door again, he always came to the back door when he needed to speak to her, which she'd started to realize was the mark of a man who understood the difference between an employer's house and a bunkhouse, without needing it explained. I wouldn't put her in there if it wasn't, he said. That's not an answer. She's still and quiet, and she doesn't make sudden movements. Midnight Jack's been watching her from the far rail for 2 days. Today's the first day he stopped watching the gate more than he was watching her. He shifted his weight. She has good instincts. She takes after her father in that regard. Rosalie paused. Thomas had good instincts with animals. Other things, less so. She didn't know why she said that. She said it anyway. Gideon didn't ask what she meant. I'll keep her at the far end and I won't push the timeline, he said. If she wants to stop, she stops. If I think Jack is off, she's out. I want your word on that. You have it." She looked at him for a moment. "She doesn't have a father to worry about her. That means I worry double." "I understand that," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he understood it from more than one angle. The second week, the mail brought a letter from the bank in Billings. Rosalie read it twice at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, then folded it carefully and sat very still for a while. The mortgage on Red Willow, the one Thomas had taken out in 1883, the one she had been making payments on, with the clockwork consistency of someone who understood what losing it would mean, had been purchased by a private buyer. The letter was formal and brief. It did not name the buyer explicitly, but referenced a transfer of note to Ketter Land and Cattle Holdings, which meant she didn't actually need it to name him. She'd been expecting something. She hadn't been expecting this. She put the letter in the bottom drawer of the desk and went out to check the cattle. She didn't tell Cully. She didn't tell Pete. She didn't tell Gideon. She told June that night, after supper, while she was brushing out the girl's hair, a habit they'd maintained since June was small, because it was one of the few moments in a working day where nothing else was required of either of them except to be in the same room. "Are we going to lose the ranch?" June asked. She asked it the way she asked most things directly, without the protective softening of hope. "Not if I can help it." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to figure out where $900 comes from before 30 days are up." She set down the brush. "It's a problem. I've had problems before." June was quiet for a moment. "Should we tell Gideon?" "No." "Why not?" Rosalie reached over and braided June's hair with the automatic competence of 4,000 repetitions. "'Cause it's not his problem. He works here. He works here. That doesn't make it his problem." June thought about this with the stubborn patience of a child who wasn't satisfied but knew when to let something rest. "Okay," she said, "but I think he'd want to know." "Maybe," Rosalie said, "but what I want isn't always what I say out loud either. People are entitled to their private worries." June considered this. "Is that a lesson? It's an observation. Go to sleep." The third week was when things stopped being merely difficult and started becoming deliberate. Cully found the first cut fence on a Wednesday morning, not the east pasture, which Gideon had already repaired, but the northern line, 2 sections clean through and folded back in a way that cattle had walked through in the night and spread out onto the neighboring Harwick property. It took Rosalie, Cully, and Pete the better part of the day to gather them, repair the fence, and deal with Ed Harwick, who was a decent man but not infinitely patient about other people's cattle on his hay meadow. Thursday, someone contaminated the lower watering hole with what turned out to be lye soap dissolved in burlap, enough to make the cattle avoid it, not enough to kill anything, but expensive in terms of what she lost when she had to keep them away from that section for a week while the water cycled clean. Friday, 2 bales of hay from the loft went missing overnight. Not a wind event, not an animal, not an accident. Gone. Rosalie stood in the empty loft space Friday evening and breathed through her nose for a long time and did not say anything she would regret. Gideon had come to find her when she didn't come in for supper. He stood at the loft ladder and looked up at her without climbing. "You going to come down?" "In a minute." He waited. She came down. "The fence, the water, now this," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, it's connected, obviously. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone wants you to feel like you can't manage it. Someone wants me to give up." She brushed the hay dust off her sleeves with short, hard strokes. "Someone who bought my mortgage 3 weeks ago and is now waiting to see how long it takes before I decide losing is easier than fighting." Gideon went very still. She looked at him. He was doing something with his face that was almost successful at concealing what was happening behind it. "Ketter," he said. "You know him." "I know of him." He said it carefully, the way you say something when you're deciding exactly how much of the sentence to use. "How?" "By reputation." He paused. "He's known for acquiring property from people who can't hold on to it." "That's a diplomatic way to put it." "I'm being careful with words I'm not sure of yet." He looked at her steadily. "How bad is the situation?" She'd told herself she wasn't going to tell him. She'd told June it wasn't his problem. She stood in the cold dark of the barn doorway and looked at the property her husband had given her and her daughter had grown up on and her own hands had bled for, and she said, "I have $900 to find in 3 weeks." Gideon exhaled slowly through his nose. All right? It's not your problem. You said that. I meant it. I know you meant it. He put his hat on. I'm going to ride the north fence line in the morning before Cully gets out. If someone's cutting it at night, there'll be tracks. She stared at him. That's not what I know it's not what you said. He stepped back toward the bunkhouse. Good night, Mrs. Danner. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him go, and she did something she almost never did. She let someone else take the first step. The tracks Gideon found Friday morning were clear enough 2 horses, shod, coming from the direction of the Ketter Range, following the creek line where the ground was soft. He said nothing to Cully or Pete about what he'd found. He came to the back door before breakfast. Rosalie looked at the description he gave her and at the rough sketch he'd made in the dirt of her doorstep before she'd stepped out. Can you prove it came from Ketter's Range? Not in a court of law. Not yet, then we wait. For what? For them to get careless. She looked up at him. They'll get careless. They always get careless when they think the person they're pushing is already broken. He looked at her for a moment. Are you? Am I what? Already broken. The question sat between them in the cold morning air. Behind her, she could hear June moving around in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee was coming through the gap in the door. No, Rosalie said. I'm not. Good. He stepped off the porch. Then we've got time. By the end of the 3rd week, Rosalie had ridden to town once to speak with the county clerk about the deed history on Red Willow, which she had been meaning to do for months and had now elevated to urgent, and once to see the lawyer, a tired man named Holt, who wore the same brown suit every time she'd ever seen him, and who told her, with the specific gentleness of someone delivering hard news to someone they respected, that her options were narrow but not yet non-existent. She was riding home from the 2nd visit when she saw Ketter's buggy on the road ahead, stopped at the cutoff where the Red Willow Road split from the main track. He was waiting for her. There was no pretense of coincidence. She pulled her horse up and sat. Ketter took off his hat. He was old-fashioned in his courtesies. She'd always noticed that about him. He had the elaborate manners of a man who used politeness as a tool rather than a habit. Mrs. Danner. He smiled. Cold afternoon for a ride. I dress warm. I imagine you do. He turned his hat in his hands once. I heard about your trouble with the fencing and the water. I'm sorry to hear it. Frontier life is hard on a woman managing alone. She looked at him and said nothing. I've been giving some thought to your situation, he said. I hold the note on Red Willow. That's not a comfortable position for either of us, I suspect. I'd like to see it resolved in a way that serves both our interests. What resolution are you proposing? He smiled again. I have a large house, Mrs. Danner. I have no wife and no children. Red Willow is fine land, better land than most people realize with that creek access. As Mrs. Ketter, you'd never worry about a mortgage again. Your daughter would have advantages that a working ranch can't provide. Rosalie didn't move. The wind came across the road and moved her horse's mane, and she sat very still in the saddle and looked at Ambrose Ketter with clear hazel eyes that gave him absolutely nothing. You're asking me to marry you, she said. I'm asking you to consider your options. I've considered them. She gathered her reins. No. His smile stayed in place, but something changed behind it. Something that had been patient became less patient. It's a hard thing to lose a ranch, Mrs. Danner, particularly when you've worked so hard for it. It is, she agreed. It would also be a hard thing to sell myself to avoid it. Good afternoon, Mr. Ketter. She put her heels to the horse and rode past him without looking back. Her hands weren't shaking. She was careful to notice that. Her hands were perfectly steady. But she rode the last 4 miles to Red Willow faster than she needed to, and when she came into the yard and saw Gideon at the stone corral, with June beside him on the fence rail and Midnight Jack standing quiet at the far end, she felt something she couldn't name exactly, not relief, not quite, but something adjacent to it. She put her horse up herself, the way she always did, and went inside to start supper, and did not tell anyone what Ketter had said on the road. She didn't need to. She already knew her answer. The morning after Rosalie rode past Ketter on the road, she woke up before the lamp was needed and lay in the dark for a while, running numbers. Not the romantic kind of numbers, not the kind people run when they're trying to talk themselves into something. The cold kind, the kind that don't care how hard you've worked or how much you deserve better. $900 in 23 days. Red Willow's horse herd was worth maybe $400 if she sold everything sound and got fair prices, which she wouldn't because everyone within riding distance knew she was in trouble, and trouble made buyers cautious and sellers desperate, and the space between those two things was where people like Ketter had made their fortunes. The cattle were mortgaged, the equipment was old, the land itself was the only real asset, and the land was exactly what she owed the money against. She got up, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs to start coffee. Gideon was already at the barn. She could see the lamp through the crack in the door from the kitchen window. He'd been doing that arriving at the barn before first light, before Cully and Pete, before anyone else was moving. She didn't know if he slept poorly or simply didn't need much, and she hadn't asked because it wasn't the kind of question that belonged in the category of her business yet. She poured coffee into 2 cups before she thought about it, then stood there for a moment looking at the second cup. She carried both of them out. The barn was warm from the animals, and Gideon was at the far end checking the hooves of the bay gelding. She'd been meaning to get the farrier out to look at. He heard her come in but didn't turn around immediately, which she'd come to recognize as a habit. Rather than rudeness, he finished whatever he was doing before he shifted his attention. And the quality of his attention, when he did shift it, was enough that she'd stopped minding the weight. Left front, she said, setting 1 cup on the rail post beside him. The frog looks like it's been wet too long. He straightened up. It has. He needs the farrier. I know. Hicks charges $3 and I've been putting it off. She said it without apology. There was something almost easier about saying hard truths in the dark of a barn before the day started, when nobody was performing anything for anybody. Gideon picked up the coffee. He looked at it for a moment like he was recalibrating something, then drank. I've been thinking about the horse herd, he said. So have I. What are you selling? She told him. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than waiting. Don't sell the 2 mares, he said. The chestnuts? They're in foal. If you sell them now, you get mare prices. If you wait until spring, you get mare prices plus foal prices, and Midnight Jack's bloodlines will add to that. She looked at him. How long have you known they were in foal? About a week. You didn't say anything. I wasn't certain until a few days ago. And I didn't know if you'd want the information factored in or not, given the timeline. She stared at him. Gideon, foals from that stallion are worth considerably more than the horses I was planning to sell. I know that. That changes the calculation. It changes part of it. He turned back toward the gelding. You still need cash before spring. Foals don't help you in 3 weeks. She stood there with her coffee and thought about it. What would you do? He glanced at her sideways. You're asking me. I'm asking you what you would do. I'll decide what I actually do. He set his cup down on the rail and thought about it. For real, not the kind of thinking that was really just a pause before saying what you'd already decided, but the actual kind, where you could see someone working through the angles. The Harwick place is running short on working horses, he said. Ed Harwick mentioned it to Cully last week. He's got spring contracts for logging work up near the timber lease, and he needs 4 animals that can handle mountain terrain. Your paint mare and those 2 geldings in the east pasture, they're not fancy, but they're mountain sound, and Harwick knows it. You might get $80 out of him if you go to him before he has to start looking around. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. He'll know I need the money. He might, but Harwick's not Ketter, he's a straight dealer. Gideon picked up his cup again. He might also know something about what's been happening to your fence, since it borders his property. She looked at him. You think he's seen something? I think a man who runs cattle along a shared fence line notices when that fence line keeps getting cut and it isn't weather doing it. She made a decision. I'll ride over this afternoon. You want me to come? No. She finished her coffee. But I want you to ride the creek boundary this morning. All of it. I want to know if there are any signs that someone has been at the water diversion gates. His expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but something that registered the specific weight of what she'd said. The water diversion gates on Red Willow Creek controlled flow, not just to her pastures, but to 2 neighboring homesteads downstream. If someone interfered with them, it wasn't just her problem. I'll go this morning, he said. Take notes, actual notes on paper. I want a record. All right. She turned to go, then stopped. The coffee. I didn't think before I poured the second cup. It wasn't she stopped. She wasn't sure what she was trying to clarify exactly. Gideon looked at her with those gray eyes that were very good at not making things harder than they needed to be. "It's coffee," he said. "It's cold out. Thank you." She went back inside. Ed Harwick was exactly what Gideon had said. He was a straight dealer. He sat across from Rosalie at his kitchen table that afternoon and listened to her describe the three horses with the unhurried attention of a man who was genuinely interested in the animals, rather than in proving anything about the transaction. And when she finished, he said, "$75 for all three." $80. He tilted his head. "$78, and I picked them up, so you don't have to deliver." Done. He poured her coffee. She was drinking a great deal of coffee these days. She noticed, and he looked at his cup for a moment before he said, "I've seen riders on the creek side of your north fence, Rosalie. Twice in the past 2 weeks after dark." She kept her face neutral. "Ketter's men? I can't say for certain. The horses were Ketter's brand, or looked it in the dark. But I can't swear to it." He looked at her. "I can say it to you here at my table. I'm not sure I could say it in a room with a judge and a Bible." "I understand." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'm building a record. If you see it again, I need to know immediately." "A note, a rider, whatever's fastest." Harwick nodded. "You're not going to fold on this?" "No." He nodded again, slower this time. "Thomas would have sold and moved on," he said, not unkindly. "I know," Rosalie said. She rode home with $78 and a clearer picture of what she was dealing with. Ketter wasn't just pressuring her through the mortgage. He was running a fence-cutting campaign designed to create enough chaos and cost that she'd exhaust herself managing the damage before she had time to think about the legal angle. It was patient and calculated, the kind of thing a man did when he was confident time was on his side. She needed to make him less confident. What she hadn't accounted for was what she found when she got back to Red Willow. Gideon met her at the gate, on foot, which was unusual. His expression was contained in the particular way of someone who has found something serious and has been waiting for the right person to tell it to. "The diversion gates," he said. She climbed down. "What about them?" "Someone's been at them. Not the big gate, the secondary channel off the main diversion, the one that feeds the McCready homestead downstream." He paused. "It's been partially blocked. Deliberately. Not enough to cut off McCready's water completely, but enough that over 2 or 3 weeks it would reduce his flow significantly." She went still. "McCready's already had a dry summer." "I know. If his water drops before the freeze, he won't have enough carry for his stock." "I know that too." Gideon looked at her with the steady focus of someone making sure the full weight of what he was saying was landing properly. "This isn't just about Red Willow anymore. Whoever is doing this is using your property to pressure your neighbors." Rosalie stood at the gate of her own ranch and felt something shift in her chest, not quite anger, though anger was in it. Something colder, more deliberate. "I need to talk to McCready," she said. "This afternoon?" "This afternoon. And I need you to come with me this time." He looked at her. She didn't explain it further, and he didn't ask her to. They rode to the McCready place, which was 3 miles downstream along the creek and smaller than Red Willow, a modest homestead that Frank McCready had been working for 6 years with his wife and 2 sons, the kind of operation that had almost nothing left over after a hard year and survived on the specific stubbornness of people who had nowhere else to go. Frank was at the woodpile when they rode up. He was a thick-built man, mid-40s, with a face permanently marked by outdoor work and the particular wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. He looked at Rosalie, then at Gideon, then back at Rosalie. "Frank," she said, "I found something at the upper diversion today that you need to know about," she told him. He didn't interrupt. His face went through several stages during the telling surprise, then a tightening that wasn't quite anger but was adjacent to it, then something harder. When she finished, he said, "I noticed the flow dropping. I thought it was the season." "It's not the season." He looked at Gideon. "Who are you?" "Gideon Rusk. I work for Mrs. Danner." "You found it?" "I did." Frank McCready was quiet for a long moment, looking at the ground between his boots. "Ketter," he said finally. "It wasn't a question." "I can't prove it yet," Rosalie said. "But yes." Frank looked up. "He offered to buy my place last spring. I told him no." He paused. He was very polite about it. "He's always polite," Rosalie said, "until he isn't." "What are you planning to do?" "I'm documenting everything. Every incident, every date, every piece of evidence." I'm going to need you to do the same for anything that happens on your property. She looked at him steadily. And I need you to talk to the Hendersons and the Varga family. Anyone downstream of that diversion who might be affected. I can't fight this alone, Frank, and I'm not going to pretend I can. He was quiet again. There was a particular kind of silence that men like Frank McCready produced when they were deciding something real, and Rosalie had learned to let it breathe rather than fill it. All right, he said. I'll talk to Henderson tomorrow. Thank you. He looked at Gideon one more time. Can you fix the diversion gate? Already fixed it, Gideon said. I wanted Mrs. Danner to see it first before I cleared it, but I cleared it on the way back through. Frank McCready looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the specific economy of a man who doesn't waste approval but means it when he gives it. They rode back in the long light of the late afternoon, the creek running beside them on the left, the mountains going dark at their tops while the lower slopes were still in sun. Rosalie rode without talking for a while, and Gideon gave her the silence without making it into anything. He'll talk to Henderson, she said after a while. Yes, and Henderson will talk to someone else. Word gets around. That's the idea, isn't it? It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. Ketter thinks I'm isolated. One widow, one mortgaged ranch, one problem he can solve by buying it. He's not thinking about what happens when the people downstreams figure out they're being used as leverage against me. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He'll figure it out when they start talking. By then, I want to have something more than talk. She glanced at him. The documents, the deed history from the county clerk. I picked them up Tuesday, and I haven't had time to go through them properly. She paused. I'd like another set of eyes on them. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him from the side and saw something happen in his expression that he controlled before it fully arrived. All right, he said. That evening after June was in bed, Rosalie spread the documents on the kitchen table. The county clerk had given her deed history going back 30 years, the original land grant, the subsequent transfers, the survey records, the water rights filings. She weighted the corners with the coffee cups and the salt cellar and stood at the head of the table, and Gideon sat at the side, and they went through it. He was quiet for a long time, reading. She watched him without appearing to, the way she watched things she was trying to understand. He read carefully, not skimming, but moving through each page, with the focused deliberateness of someone who was looking for something specific rather than seeing what was there. When he reached the 1,879 water rights filing, he stopped. She saw it. The stillness was different from his reading stillness. What is it? She said. He didn't answer right away. He put his finger on the page, not pointing at anything specific, just holding his place, and he looked at it for another long moment. This signature, he said, on the witness line. She leaned over and looked. The signature was cramped and a little irregular, the kind of handwriting that suggested the person hadn't been entirely comfortable with the pen. R. Briggs, witness. Do you know that name? She asked. Gideon took his finger off the page. He sat back. There was a property up north, he said slowly. Upstream of this creek, on the land that controls the source. My father owned it. She looked at him. This was the most he had ever said about himself voluntarily, and she understood without needing to be told that it was costing him something to say it. Go on, she said, keeping her voice level. He lost it in 1,880. Or what they called losing it, he was accused of cattle theft. The evidence was a signed statement from 2 witnesses and a bill of sale that nobody in the family had ever seen before. His voice was even, the particular evenness of someone who has said something painful enough times that the pain has been worn to a smooth edge. The witnesses signed over their statements. The land was forfeit as part of the settlement. The man who bought it at the subsequent auction was Ambrose Ketter. Rosalie was very still. R. Briggs, she said, was one of the witnesses. He looked at her. The other witness's name was on the statement that convicted my father. I've been looking for Briggs for 2 years. I didn't know he was connected to Red Willow. She sat down. The kitchen was quiet around them. The lamp made its small warm circle on the table, and outside the wind had come up and was pushing at the corners of the house the way it did in November, finding every gap. Your father, she said. Was he guilty? No. Flat and certain, not defensive, the certainty of someone who had examined the question from every angle and arrived at the same place every time. He was in the wrong place, and Ketter wanted the land. Briggs and the other man were paid to say what Ketter needed them to say, and the upstream property, the one that controls the creek source. Ketter's held it since 1880. He met her eyes, which means he controls where the water comes from. He's been tolerating your access because it wasn't worth the trouble to cut it off. But if he acquires Red Willow, he controls the entire creek valley. She finished it. From the source to the downstream properties. Every homestead along this creek becomes dependent on Ketter's goodwill for their water. Yes, she looked at the documents on the table. Then she looked at Gideon. You came here because of Ketter, she said. He held her look. I came here because I needed to sell a horse for $20. I didn't know your ranch was connected to any of this until I started working the fence lines and recognized the creek. But you stayed. A pause, I stayed. She wasn't angry. She wanted to check. She pressed at the inside of herself, the way you press at a bruise, to see how bad it is, and what she found wasn't anger. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with the fact that she had trusted this man with her daughter in a corral with a dangerous stallion, and her assessment hadn't been wrong. And the fact that he had ridden the fence line and fixed the diversion gate and come to her back door every evening with what he found, and none of that changed because he had a reason for being here that he hadn't told her. People were entitled to their private worries. She'd said that herself. Is Briggs still alive? She asked. I believe so. I have a name he's going by now. He moved to a town about 40 miles southeast of here in '84. He paused. I've been working on a way to reach him without Ketter finding out. If Briggs will talk, then I have a witness who can testify that the documents that took my father's land were forged. And if those documents were forged, he stopped. Then the land transfer was fraudulent, Rosalie finished. And if the original acquisition was fraudulent, everything Ketter built on top of it is questionable. She was thinking fast now, the way she thought when the numbers started to line up. Including the water rights. Including whatever he used to pressure the bank into selling my mortgage. I don't know how far it goes, Gideon said. That's what I don't know yet. But it could go very far. It could. She sat with that for a moment. The wind pushed at the house again. I want you to find Briggs, she said. I was planning to, before the 30 days are up. I know the timeline. I mean it as a practical constraint, not a criticism. She looked at him. If you can get to Briggs and back within 2 weeks, I can hold Ketter off the ranch. I have $78 from Harwick. I can sell the 2 geldings in the south pasture for another $50 if I push. It won't cover the $900, but it might buy enough time for the legal angle to. You're not going to make $900 in 3 weeks, Gideon said. I know that. Then what's the plan? She looked at him steadily. The plan is that I don't need $900 in 3 weeks. I need the debt to be legally challenged before the 30 days expire. There's a difference. She tapped the documents on the table. If Ketter's original acquisition of the upstream property was fraudulent, his standing to purchase my mortgage may be challengeable. Holt thinks there's a case. It's thin, but it's there. Gideon was quiet. She could see him working through it. It's a gamble, he said. Yes. If it doesn't work. I know what happens if it doesn't work. She met his eyes. I've been living with what happens if it doesn't work for the past 3 weeks. I don't need it described to me. He held up one hand, a small conceding gesture. All right, find Briggs, she said. I'll handle the rest. He left the next morning before breakfast, which he told Cully was a supply run to the mill, which was technically in the direction he was going, so it wasn't entirely a lie. Rosalie watched him saddle his horse through the kitchen window while the coffee boiled, and she noticed that he tied his bedroll and a 3-day food supply to the back, and she said nothing about it to Cully or Pete. The 2 days he was gone were the longest 2 days she'd had since the first week after Thomas died. She didn't waste them. She met with Holt again on the first day and spent 2 hours going through the documents with him, while he took careful notes and asked careful questions and finally said, with the measured precision of a man who had learned that optimism was expensive, there may be something here. I want to write to a colleague in Helena who knows water law. On the second day, she rode to the Varga property on the South Creek and talked to Maria Varga, a small dark-haired woman who ran her operation with her brother since her husband had died of pneumonia 2 winters ago, and who listened to what Rosalie said with the focused stillness of someone converting information directly into action. He approached us in August, Maria said. about buying the water rights separate from the land. We said no. She paused. He said we'd reconsider. He's been patient, Rosalie said. Too patient. Maria looked at her. What do you need from us? Anything you have in writing. Any letter he sent, any record of any communication. And your testimony that he made the offer. I have the letter, Maria said. He wrote it, which was stupid of him. Rosalie could not entirely suppress what happened to her face when she heard that. Yes, she said. It was. She rode home that afternoon in better spirits than she'd been in for 2 weeks, which she recognized as potentially dangerous hope was expensive. Holt had said, and he was right, but she let herself have it anyway, for the length of the ride because she was human, and she was tired. And sometimes you needed to let yourself feel like things might work before you went back to making sure they did. Gideon came back on the third morning. She was at the barn when he rode in, earlier than she'd expected, and she read his face before he said anything. Not triumph, he wasn't the triumphant kind, but something that looked like a door opening after a long time. Did you find him? She said. He dismounted. He was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had ridden hard and slept poorly and was running on whatever was on the other side of all that. I found him, he said. She waited. He's an old man now. Sick. I think he's not well. He lives alone in a boarding house in Garnet Crossing, and he's been living with what he did for 8 years, and it hasn't been comfortable for him. Gideon tied his horse and turned to face her. He talked to me for 2 hours. He told me everything. The cattle theft charge was manufactured. Ketter paid him and the other man, a man named Cole, who died in $86 $20 each, to sign the witness statements and the forged bill of sale. Rosalie felt the words go through her like cold water. $20. Gideon's father's land and name for $20 each. Will he testify? She asked. He'll sign an affidavit. He's not well enough to travel for a full proceeding, but his signed statement before a notary public will hold up. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He signed it yesterday. There was a notary in Garnet Crossing. She looked at the document. She didn't take it from him. She looked at it in his hands. Gideon, she said, I'm sorry. About your father. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't entirely manage to control this time. He died in '83, he said. Didn't live long enough to see the name cleared. His voice was even. He spent the last 3 years of his life as a man everyone thought was a thief. She didn't say anything. She understood that certain things you didn't put words around. I want to show this to Holt, she said after a moment. That's why I rode 40 miles and back. She almost smiled. Come inside and eat something. You look like you're about to fall down. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're swaying slightly. Come inside. He came inside. June was at the table doing her schoolwork, and she looked up when Gideon sat down with the particular attention she paid to things that mattered. You were gone 3 days, June said. Yes, I was. Did you find what you were looking for? Gideon looked at her for a moment. Yes. June nodded with the satisfied air of someone whose prediction has been confirmed, and went back to her arithmetic. Rosalie set food in front of him and went to the desk and began writing a letter to Holt. And outside the window the creek ran on the same as it always had, through the November cold, carrying snowmelt from the mountains through the valley and past Red Willow, and on down to the McCready place and the Varga property, and all the smaller homesteads beyond. And what it carried in its water nobody owned, and nobody could mortgage and nobody could take, though men like Ketter had been trying to find ways around that fact, for as long as there had been men and water in the same valley. She wrote the letter and sealed it and addressed it, and she looked at the affidavit on the table, and she thought about Gideon's father, and she thought about her own father, who had told her once when she was June's age that the only thing worth fighting for was the thing you'd built with your own hands, because that was the only thing that was truly yours. She thought Gideon's father had probably believed something similar. She thought she understood now why Gideon Rusk had ridden 40 miles there, and back in 3 days on a borrowed promise and a long shot. Some fights you took on because you had no choice. Some you took on because the alternative was becoming a person you couldn't live with. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at the window for a moment, at the cold gray November sky beyond it. Then she picked up the letter and went to saddle a horse for the ride to town. Holt read the affidavit twice, standing at his desk with his coat still on from coming in from the cold, and Rosalie watched him read it the way she watched everything with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that reaction was a resource best spent carefully. When he finished the second read, he set it down and looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. "Where did this come from?" he said. "A man named Briggs. He was a witness on the 1,880 land transfer that took the Rusk property upstream. He signed a notarized affidavit 3 days ago in Garnet Crossing stating that the transfer documents were fraudulent, that the cattle theft charge against the elder Rusk was manufactured, that he was paid $20 by Ambrose Ketter to sign a false witness statement." Holt looked at the document again. "This Briggs, he's credible? He's an old man with a bad conscience and not long to live," which is exactly the kind of credible that holds up, in my experience. Holt sat down. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them with the corner of his shirt, which was what he did when he was thinking hard and wanted something to do with his hands. "You understand what this does and doesn't do," he said. "Tell me. It gives us a legitimate legal challenge to the original Rusk land transfer. If that transfer was fraudulent, Ketter's title to the upstream property is potentially void." He put his spectacles back on. "It does not automatically void your mortgage. Ketter purchased that debt legitimately from the bank, regardless of how he acquired the upstream land. Those are two separate legal instruments. But if the upstream acquisition was fraudulent," she said, "and Ketter's water rights claim is based on that acquisition, then his ability to threaten downstream properties with water restriction, which may have been part of his leverage over the bank when he arranged to purchase your note, could be challenged." He looked at her. "It's an argument. It may be a good one. It is not a certain one. I'm not asking for certain. I'm asking for enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to get us in front of a judge before the 30 days expire. Enough to put Ketter on the defensive instead of the offensive." She leaned forward slightly. "Enough to make him nervous." Holt was quiet for a moment. The stove in the corner of his office ticked as the metal expanded in the heat. Outside on the main street of Copper Hollow, a wagon went by and someone called to someone else, and their voices faded. "I need to write to Helena," he said. "The territorial court has jurisdiction over land fraud of this nature. If I can get a judge to issue a temporary injunction against the foreclosure while the fraud claim is investigated." "How long will that take?" "To write the letter? Today. To receive a response?" He paused. 2 weeks if we're fortunate. 3 if we're not. I have 18 days. Then we need to be fortunate." He picked up his pen. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. All of it." She was in Holt's office for 3 hours. When she came out, the afternoon had gone gray and cold, and the street was mostly empty. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment in the wind and let herself breathe, and then she rode home. Gideon was at the stone corral with June when she got back. He had the girl in the corral again, not at the far end anymore, but halfway in, standing still with her arm extended, and Midnight Jack was 3 feet away with his head stretched toward her outstretched hand, not quite touching. The specific trembling attention of an animal suspended between what it wanted and what it was afraid of. Rosalie stopped her horse at the fence and watched. June didn't move. Gideon, standing at the rail to the girl's left, didn't move either. Nobody breathed louder than necessary. Midnight Jack's muzzle dropped the last inch. June's face did something that Rosalie filed away in the permanent part of her memory, the part that didn't have anything to do with account books or legal strategy or any of the machinery of survival. Just pure, unguarded wonder, a 9-year-old girl who had held her arm out long enough to be chosen by something wild, and the particular joy of that. "Good," Gideon said very quietly. "Stay still. Let him decide." The stallion breathed against June's palm. Then he lifted his head and turned away, and June lowered her arm and turned to look at Gideon, with her eyes lit up like the first hard frost had just come off the ground. "He did it," she whispered. "He did," Gideon said. Rosalie cleared her throat. They both looked at her. June's expression shifted from wonder to something more measured, the particular recalibration of a child who remembered that her mother had opinions about corral safety, and Gideon's face moved through something she didn't entirely catch before it settled back into its usual even lines. "Holt is writing to Helena," she said. "He thinks we have enough for a challenge." Gideon nodded slowly. "How long? 2 weeks for a response?" "Maybe 3. You have 18 days. "I know I have 18 days. He looked at her steadily. "All right. All right, she said, and rode her horse to the barn. She heard June say to Gideon, in the carrying way of children who assumed they were quieter than they were, "Is Mama okay?" "Your mother's been okay through worse than this," Gideon said. "She'll be okay through this, too." Rosalie didn't know what to do with that, so she put her horse up and went to supper. The next week was the strangest she could remember since the first weeks after Thomas died, the particular strangeness of waiting for something you couldn't control while trying to run out of things you could. She checked the creek boundaries every other morning. She sent Cully to ride the north fence every evening. She wrote 2 letters, one to the county land office requesting the full history of the upstream Rusk property transfer, and one to a woman she knew in Billings who had a husband who worked in the territorial records office, asking for anything he could find on Ketter land and cattle holdings going back to 1878. She sold the South Pasture geldings to a buyer in Copper Hollow for $52, which was less than they were worth, and exactly as much as she had the leverage to get. She started sleeping poorly, which she didn't tell anyone. Gideon noticed anyway, the way he noticed things, not intrusively, just accurately. He brought coffee to the barn on the mornings she arrived early, which happened more frequently as the days counted down, and he said nothing about the circles under her eyes or the occasional flat quality in her voice that she couldn't entirely manage when she was running on 3 hours of sleep. What he did do was keep working. The fence lines stayed repaired. The water gates were checked every 2 days, and he built a simple lock mechanism on the main diversion valve out of iron scraps and fence wire, not elegant, but effective enough that anyone interfering with it would have to make noise and leave evidence. He found a loose corner post on the barn and reinforced it before the wall it was holding could settle any further. He winterized the irrigation channel that fed the kitchen garden and saved Rosalie the cost of having it rebuilt in spring. He didn't present any of this as a list. He just did it, and she noticed, and neither of them turned the noticing into something that needed to be discussed. On the 12th day before the deadline, a rider came from Holt. Not a letter, a rider, which meant it was either very good or very bad. Rosalie was at the north fence with Cully when the rider came through the gate, and she read the urgency in the way he was sitting his horse from 200 yards away and came in fast. The message was short. Ketter has learned of the affidavit. Source unknown. He has retained 2 lawyers from Billings. He is not planning to move on the foreclosure before the 30-day period expires, possibly as early as the 24th. Come to town immediately. Holt, she read it twice. The 24th was 4 days away. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and looked at the fence she'd been inspecting and at Cully standing beside her with the expression of a man who was trying to read the situation from her face and not finding it easy. "Get Pete," she said. "Both of you stay on the property. Don't let anyone you don't recognize pass the gate. If Ketter's men show up, you don't argue with them, but you don't let them in either. You send someone for me." "Where are you going?" "Town." She was already walking back toward her horse. "And tell Gideon I need him." She found Gideon at the stone corral and told him in 4 sentences. His face went through something trolled and precise, the same focused shift she'd seen when he first saw the documents on her kitchen table, and he said, "I'm coming with you. I was going to ask you to." They rode into Copper Hollow together, at a pace that was not quite a gallop, and not quite the measured trot of people who weren't worried. And the cold afternoon air cut at her face, and she leaned into it and thought about the 24th, and about Briggs's shaking hands on that affidavit, and about June's face when the stallion finally touched her palm. Holt's office was warm and close, and he had papers spread across every surface. He looked up when they came in, and his expression was the specific controlled alarm of a man who had spent 30 years in frontier law and had learned that panic was expensive, but so was false calm. "He knows about the affidavit," Holt said. "Someone talked, I don't know who, but the information reached Ketter's people within 2 days of me writing to Helena. He's moved up his timeline. He's planning to arrive at Red Willow on the morning of the 24th, with his lawyers and a deed of seizure." "Can he do that?" Rosalie asked. "The 30 days aren't up." "His lawyers are arguing that the documented damage to his collateral," that's the language they're using, "collateral constitutes grounds for accelerated foreclosure under the terms of the original mortgage." Holt looked at her. The fence damage. The supposed mismanagement. They're going to argue that you've allowed the property to deteriorate and that accelerated action is warranted to protect the lender's interest. That's the damage he caused, Gideon said. It came out flat and hard. Yes, and proving that in the next 4 days is considerably more difficult than we'd like. Holt sat down. I have not yet received a response from Helena. I sent a second letter this morning by the fastest rider I could hire, but I cannot guarantee an answer before the 24th. The room was quiet for a moment. What do I have? Rosalie said. Holt looked at the documents on his desk. You have a notarized affidavit alleging fraud in a related land transaction. You have testimony from 2 neighboring landowners about irregular approaches from Ketter. You have Maria Varga's letter, which is genuinely useful. He paused. And you have my professional opinion that the underlying fraud claim is legitimate and would succeed before a fair judge. What I don't have is a judge, she said. Not yet. Gideon had been standing at the edge of the room, listening. She was aware of him, the way she was aware of the stove, a steady presence, producing a consistent heat that she'd stopped consciously noticing, but would feel the absence of immediately. The neighbors, he said. Both of them looked at him. McCready, Harwick, Varga, Henderson. He looked at Rosalie. You said word gets around. How much has it gotten around? She thought about it. Frank talked to Henderson. Maria Varga has talked to at least 2 other families downstream. Harwick knows the full picture. What if they came to the ranch on the 24th? Holt frowned. To what end? Ketter is planning to arrive with lawyers and a deed of seizure and 2 riders to make it formal, Gideon said. He's expecting a widow and a hired hand and an empty yard. If the yard isn't empty, he stopped. He can't legally be stopped by neighbors standing in a yard, Holt said. No, but he can be witnessed. Gideon looked at Rosalie. Every action he takes, every word his lawyers say, every document they produce, witnessed by the people who have the most at stake if he controls that creek. And if he knows he's being witnessed, he may hesitate. He may make a mistake. He may say something he shouldn't. He paused. Men like Ketter are comfortable in empty rooms. They're less comfortable in full ones. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. You think he'll overreach? I think he already has overreached, with the fence cutting and the water gate. I think if he's under pressure and in public, he'll do it again. His voice was even. He's been doing this for years to people who are alone and scared. He doesn't have a good script for someone who isn't. Holt was looking at Gideon with an expression that had shifted from the cautious assessment of a lawyer evaluating an unfamiliar argument to something slightly warmer. It's not a legal strategy, he said. No, Gideon agreed. It's a different kind. Rosalie made a decision. She'd been making decisions all her life in the specific way of people who couldn't afford to make the wrong ones, but couldn't afford to make none at all quickly, with whatever information she had, accepting the risk of being wrong because the alternative was worse. I'll ride to the Harwick place tonight, she said. Gideon, can you get to McCready? Yes. Tell them what's happening. Tell them to bring whoever they think should be there. I'm not asking them to fight. I'm asking them to stand on my land and see what happens. She looked at Holt. Can you be there? Holt was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, she'd always known that about him, but careful wasn't the same as timid, and she'd known that about him too. I'll be there, he said, and I'll bring the letter to Helena's court, even without a response. Sometimes the act of filing matters as much as the filing itself. She nodded. Then we have 4 days to get ready. She rode to Harwick's that evening and talked to Ed for 40 minutes in his kitchen while his wife put coffee on without being asked and listened from the other side of the table with the concentrated attention of a woman who understood that the decisions made at kitchen tables were the real ones. Harwick said yes without deliberating long. I'll bring Henderson, he said. Henderson will bring his brother-in-law. That's 3 more families with water rights on that creek. I don't want anyone there who's going to be reckless, Rosalie said. They won't be reckless. They'll be angry, which is different. He looked at her. You understand what you're doing. Putting myself in the middle of something that was always going to get worse before it got better, she said. He nodded. I've seen Ketter take 3 ranches in this valley. The Aldersons, the Purcell family, the Crane homestead. All of them alone when it happened. He picked up his coffee. None of them had what you have. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. She didn't ask. She rode home in the full dark, navigating by the creek sound and the faint starlight on the road, And when she came into the yard, Gideon was already back from McCready's place, his horse tied outside the barn, and a lamp burning in the bunkhouse. She knocked on the bunkhouse door, which she'd never done before. "Come in," he said. He was at the small table inside, writing something by the lamp. He put the pen down when she entered. The bunkhouse was Spartan in the way of a man who didn't own much and had learned not to accumulate what he couldn't carry. A change of clothes on a hook, saddlebags at the foot of the cot, his rifle in the corner, cleaned and maintained. The affidavit, she noticed, was in a flat tin box on the table beside where he'd been writing. "McCready," she asked. "He'll be there. Varga family, too." He rode over after I spoke to him. He glanced at the tin box. "I've been making a copy of the affidavit." She looked at the box. "Why a copy?" "Because if Ketter's lawyers try to take the original, I want us to still have something." He held her look. "I don't know what he'll do when he arrives. I'd rather be careful than write." She thought about that. "Where will the copy go?" "Holt should have one. I'll write it to him tomorrow." He paused. "I also wrote down everything I know about the 1,880 transfer. Everything Briggs told me, in as much detail as I could put on paper. Names, dates, amounts, the sequence of events. In case," he stopped. "In case what?" "In case I'm not available to testify myself," he said carefully. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ketter recognized me at the auction. I saw it in his face. I don't know how much he knows about what I've been doing, but if he connected me to Briggs..." Another pause. "He has a lot of money and a lot of patience, and this valley isn't that big." The implication sat in the air between them. "You think he might try to remove you from the picture," she said. "I think he might try to create a situation where I'm not able to testify or support your case on the 24th. He said it with the same evenness he used for everything, which she had come to understand was not the same as calm. It was the kind of voice people used when they were managing something by refusing to let it get bigger than its actual size. "I'm not trying to alarm you. I'm trying to be practical. If something happened to you," she said slowly, "the affidavit would still be valid." "Yes. Briggs signed it. I witnessed it. It stands its own. But you're the one who can explain how it connects to what Ketter is doing to this ranch. You're the one who knows the full picture, which is why I've written it down." He tapped the papers on the table. "And why you should read all of this tonight and know it as well as I do." She pulled the chair from against the wall and sat down across the small table from him, and he passed her the pages he'd written, and she read them in the lamplight, while the cold pressed at the thin walls of the bunkhouse, and the lamp made its small, warm world around the two of them. When she finished, she set the pages down and was quiet for a moment. "Your father built the upstream water claim by hand," she said. "He diverted the creek himself. 18 months of work." "Yes. And Ketter took it in 3 weeks with $20 and 2 dishonest men." "Yes." She looked at him. In the lamplight, he was tired in a way that didn't usually show the specific tiredness as someone who had been carrying a thing so long that the weight of it had become invisible to them and only became visible at moments like this one, in a quiet room with nobody performing anything for anyone. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at the table. "You said that already." "I meant it then, and I mean it now." She folded the papers and set them beside the tin box. "He was working to build something for his family, and they took it. That's not a small thing. No," he was quiet, "it's not. June's father was working to build something for his family when he died," she said. "The particulars were different. But I understand some part of it. Anyway, the feeling of watching something that was supposed to be there become not there." Gideon looked at her. It was a direct look, the kind he usually kept carefully controlled. "It's not the same," he said. "No, nothing's ever exactly the same." She stood up. "But people who've had things taken from them recognize each other. I think that's why I hired you." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I thought you hired me because I was the only one who could handle the horse," he said. "I hired you because you were the only one who could handle the horse, and because something in the way you looked at that animal told me you understood what it felt like to be held down and not trusted." She moved toward the door. "Get some sleep. We have 4 days." She was almost out when he said Rosalie. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for not throwing me off the property when you found out I had reasons for being here." She considered that for a moment. "Thank you for staying when you could have ridden on," she said. She went back across the frozen yard to the house. The next 3 days were the kind that she would later find difficult to describe, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was mostly internal. The particular siege of waiting when you'd done everything you could do, and the time for doing was suspended. She rode to Holt with Gideon's copy of the affidavit on the first day. She spent the second day preparing the ranch, not staging it, because she was not the staging kind, but making sure that what people saw when they came was a working operation, not an abandoned one. The cattle were in the upper pasture, where they were most visible and in the best condition. The repaired fence lines were evident. The Watergate lock was in place. She told June on the evening of the second day. They were at the table after supper, June doing her reading and Rosalie mending a harness strap, and Rosalie set the strap down and said, "Something is happening on the 24th. There will be people here, Mr. Ketter and his men, and Mr. Holt and some of our neighbors. It may be loud and there may be arguments. I need you to stay inside unless I tell you otherwise." June looked up from her book. "Is someone going to try to take the ranch?" "Someone is going to try," Rosalie said. "I don't intend to let them. What if they don't listen? Then we keep saying it until they do." She picked the strap back up. "Some people are only convinced by something they can see and hear and count. We're going to give them something to count." June was quiet for a moment. "Will Gideon be there?" "Yes." "Good." She went back to her reading with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 9-year-old who had made her assessment and filed it under settled. The night before the 24th, Rosalie didn't sleep at all. She lay in the dark and ran through every angle and found the gaps she didn't have answers for and tried to make peace with the gaps, which she mostly failed at, and eventually got up and sat at the kitchen table in the cold and dark and thought about her father's saying about build things with your own hands. The gray light of morning was just starting when she heard a knock at the back door. She opened it. Gideon was on the step, fully dressed and awake in the way of someone who also hadn't slept, though he was better at hiding it. "They're coming early," he said. Cully just saw dust on the south road. "At least 4 riders." She looked at the lightening sky. "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less, she nodded. "Go wake Cully and Pete. I'll get dressed." He stepped off the porch. "Gideon," he stopped. "The affidavit, where is it?" "On my person," he said. "Good." She held his throat for one moment. "Stay visible. Whatever happens, stay where people can see you." He understood what she meant. "I will," he said. She shut the door and went to get dressed, and from upstairs she heard June stir and she called up, "Stay in your room until I come for you." And June said, "Yes, Mama," in the clear, immediate way that meant she already knew something was happening. Rosalie Danner braided her hair without looking at the mirror, put on the good coat she wore for town, and went downstairs to wait on her own porch for a man who thought she would be easy to break. She'd been waiting 17 minutes when Ambrose Ketter's buggy came through the gate of Red Willow Ranch, with 2 riders on either side, and a third man she didn't recognize, beside him, who had the precise dark coat and the professional flatness of expression of a man paid to argue. Behind them, on the road, she could see more dust. That wasn't Ketter's dust. Ketter pulled his buggy up in front of the porch and looked at her, standing there with her arms at her sides and her chin level. And then he looked at the yard around her, at Cully and Pete positioned at the barn, at Gideon standing at the gate of the stone corral with his arms folded, at Holt's horse already tied to the post at the corner of the fence. Something moved through Ketter's face. It was brief and controlled, but she'd been watching him long enough to read it. He hadn't expected a full yard. He got out of the buggy and took off his hat. The courtesy was automatic, years of habit, but there was less warmth behind it than there had been on the road when he'd smiled and offered her a house and his name. "Mrs. Danner," he said, "I believe you know why we're here." "I believe I do," she said. The dust on the road resolved into riders. 6 of them. Ed Harwick in front, with Henderson beside him, and 2 other men she recognized from the creek properties behind them. Frank McCready on the far right, with his older son. They came through the gate and stopped in a rough line, 20 feet back from Ketter's buggy. Ketter turned and looked at them. He turned back to Rosalie. "This is a legal proceeding," he said. "These men have no standing here. They have standing as witnesses," Holt said from the corner, where he had appeared with his coat buttoned and his papers under his arm. "On private property, by the property owner's invitation, their presence is entirely lawful." Ketter's lawyer said something low to him. Ketter ignored it. "You're 48 hours early," Rosalie said. "My 30 days don't expire until the 26th. Under the terms of the mortgage, evidence of material deterioration of the collateral allows for accelerated action," the lawyer said. His voice was practiced and smooth. "We have documented evidence." "You have documented vandalism," Gideon said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't moved from his position at the stone corral gate, but his voice carried clearly across the yard. "The fence damage, the water contamination, the missing hay," he said. "I've been tracking it for 6 weeks. 2 horses, shod, Ketter brand, approaching from the South Creek access on at least 4 documented occasions. I have dates, times, and track measurements." He paused. "The deterioration your lawyer is citing was caused by your employer's men." Ketter looked at Gideon with an expression that had changed from the careful social blankness of a man managing a business meeting into something older and colder. "You're the Rusk boy," he said. The yard went very quiet. "I am," Gideon said. "Your father was a thief." "No," Gideon said. "He wasn't. And I have a signed affidavit from the man you paid $20 to say he was." Ketter's lawyer put a hand on his employer's arm. Ketter shook it off. "Whatever Briggs told you, he started. He told me everything," Gideon said. "And he signed it in front of a notary. And Mr. Holt has filed a copy with the territorial court in Helena." He finally moved away from the corral gate, not toward Ketter, just standing more openly in the middle of the yard. "You framed my father for cattle theft to take his water rights. You used those water rights to pressure every landowner along this creek for 8 years. And you bought Mrs. Danner's mortgage specifically because her land is the last piece you need to control the full valley." Ed Harwick had ridden his horse forward 2 steps without seeming to be aware of it. Frank McCready was very still. Ketter's face had gone to something Rosalie hadn't seen on it before, not anger, not contempt. Calculation, pure and cold. He was looking at Gideon and then at the affidavit question and then at the riders behind him, and he was doing his math the same way she'd been doing hers for 3 weeks. "Mr. Ketter," his lawyer said, more urgently. Then Ketter did the thing she'd been waiting for. He looked at the rider on his right and gave a short nod. The rider moved toward Gideon, and Gideon turned and opened the gate of the stone corral. Midnight Jack came out like a river breaking a dam. The stallion hit the yard at full stride, enormous and black and absolutely certain of his direction, which was away from the noise and toward the open gate. And he went through the middle of the space between Ketter's buggy and the gathered riders like a force of weather that nobody had voted on. Ketter's carriage horse reared. 2 of the neighboring men's horses shied hard to the left. The rider who'd been moving toward Gideon hauled his horse around, trying to control it, and the document case he'd been reaching for slid off his saddle and hit the frozen ground. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was trampled. Midnight Jack had cut a clean line straight for the open pasture gate that Cully, moving with a speed that suggested he'd been expecting something, had opened at exactly the right moment. But in the 10 seconds of chaos, Gideon had moved. He crossed the yard and picked up the document case from the ground. He was back at his original position before the dust settled. The rider looked at him, then at his empty hands, then at Ketter. Ketter looked at Gideon with the kind of look that was deciding things. "Those documents belong to my client," the lawyer said. "These documents?" Gideon held up the case. "I'm happy to give them to Mr. Holt as evidence." Holt was already walking across the yard. And that was when the sound of additional horses reached the gate of Red Willow Ranch, not from the south road, but from the north, from the direction of the county seat. And the rider in front was wearing the kind of coat that territorial marshals wore on official business. Ketter heard it before he turned. She saw it in his shoulders. She'd contacted the marshal's office 10 days ago after Holt's second letter. A quiet note, carefully worded, describing documented evidence of land fraud and requesting that a lawful officer be present at any foreclosure proceeding on the 24th. The marshal rode through the gate with 2 deputies and pulled up beside Holt and looked around the yard with the patient attention of a man who was used to arriving at complicated situations. "Mr. Holt," he said, "got your letter. Looks like we're just in time." Ketter stood between his buggy and the porch of Rosalie Danner's house, with 6 of his neighbors watching him and a territorial marshal 20 feet away, and a notarized affidavit in the hands of a lawyer who intended to use it. And for the first time since Rosalie had encountered him, Ambrose Ketter had absolutely nothing to say. She looked at him from her porch. She was standing where she started, exactly where she'd placed herself before any of this unfolded. And she had not moved, and she had not shouted, and she had not reached for anything she didn't already have. "Mr. Ketter," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. "You're on my land without my invitation. I'd like you to leave." Ketter left. Not immediately. Men like Ketter didn't do anything immediately that could be interpreted as retreat, but he left. His lawyer spoke quietly to him for 2 minutes beside the buggy, while the marshal waited and the neighbors watched, and the yard held the specific charged silence of a situation that had almost become something worse and hadn't. And then Ketter climbed back into his buggy, and his riders fell in around him, and he drove back through the gate of Red Willow Ranch without looking at Rosalie again. She watched him go from the porch. She didn't move until the dust from his wheels had settled back onto the road, and the sound of the buggy had faded past the cottonwoods. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had decided they were finished performing for the morning. The marshal, whose name was Aldous Crane, no relation to the Crane family Ketter had taken, which she noted as one of those small ironies that frontier life produced without commentary, came to the porch and introduced himself and spent 40 minutes with her and Holt going through the sequence of events and the documents while the bluff. Neighbors dismounted and stood in the yard in the cold and waited with the patient solidarity of people who had come a long way for something and weren't leaving until they understood what had happened. Gideon stood apart from all of it, at the edge of the barn, with the document case still in his hands. He'd given Holt the affidavit when the lawyer asked for it, but he'd held on to the case itself. And she noticed him, going through the papers inside, with a careful, methodical attention that was separate from whatever else was happening in the yard. When Crane finally finished with her, she went to Gideon. "What's in it?" she said. He handed her one page without a word. It was a deed, or rather, it was a copy of a deed, the kind of copy a lawyer made for his files, not the original for a property in the Upper Creek Valley. The date was 1879. The name on the deed was not Ketter's. She looked up. "This is your father's land, original deed copy." Ketter's lawyer had it. He looked at the page in her hands. "I don't know if he intended to use it or if it was just in the case because it's part of the chain of title he needs to show clean ownership. But it shouldn't be in his possession. The original should be in the county records. A copy should be with the Rusk estate." He paused. "My father never had an estate. He died with nothing." She looked at the document for a moment longer, then at him. "Crane needs to see this." "I know. Now, while he's still here." "I know that too." He took it back carefully. "I wanted you to see it first." She wasn't sure why that mattered to him, but she could tell that it did, and she let it. They brought it to Crane together. The marshal looked at it, then at Gideon, then at Holt, with the measured attention of a man assembling a picture he was going to have to carry a long way. "If this deed copy was in Ketter's legal files," Crane said, "it suggests his lawyers know the original transfer is questionable." "They may not know how questionable," Holt said, "or they may know precisely how questionable and have been gambling that no one with standing would ever file a challenge." "Briggs's affidavit gives us standing," Gideon said. Crane looked at him. "You're the Rusk son." "Yes, sir." "Your father was the Rusk who lost the upstream property in '80. "He didn't lose it," Gideon said. "It was taken." Crane held his look for a moment. "I'm going to need you in the county seat on Monday. Can you make that ride?" "Yes." "Bring everything you have." "The affidavit, your written account of what Briggs told you, any dates or records you've kept since you arrived at this ranch." He looked at Rosalie. "And you, Mrs. Danner, everything you have on the fence damage, the water gate, all of it." "I have a record going back 6 weeks," she said. "Good." He tucked the deed copy into his own coat with a deliberateness that told her it wasn't going back to Ketter's lawyer. "I'm going to be honest with you both. This investigation is going to take time. Months, possibly. Land fraud cases are slow because the paper is complicated, and the money on the other side is patient." "I have 18 days left on a mortgage Ketter holds," Rosalie said. "I know." Crane looked at Holt. "What's the legal status of the note?" "If the fraud challenge succeeds in territorial court, the mortgage may be voided on the grounds that Ketter's acquisition of the upstream property, which was used as collateral leverage in his arrangement with the bank, was itself fraudulent." Holt took off his spectacles. In the meantime, I intend to file for an emergency injunction against foreclosure proceedings pending investigation. It's not guaranteed, but given what we have today, a judge may grant it. File today, Crane said. I intend to. Ed Harwick had drifted closer during this conversation, and when there was a gap, he said, "What about the rest of us? The approach is Keter made to the downstream properties. The water restriction is that part of the investigation." "It will be," Crane said. "If what you're describing is a coordinated pattern of coercion using water rights as leverage, that's a separate charge from the original land fraud, but they're connected." He looked at Harwick, then at McCready, then at the other men. "I'll need statements from each of you. Written, signed before a notary if possible." "Can you do that?" The men looked at each other with the specific communication of people who had come a long way on a hard road and were not going back without something to show for it. "Yes," Harwick said. The yard took another hour to clear. People talk not about strategy, just the low, sustained talk of people processing something together, comparing notes, the particular human need to say out loud what you've just witnessed so it becomes more real. Rosalie moved through it, answered questions, thanked people for coming, shook hands she didn't expect to shake, and kept one part of her mind separate from all of it, running the numbers and the angles and the gaps, the way she always did. When the last of the neighbors had ridden out, and Crane and his deputies had taken the road to the county seat, and Holt had gone to file his papers, the yard was quiet again. Cully and Pete went back to the barn without being asked, and the specific post-event exhaustion of a morning that had required everything settled into the air of Red Willow like the cold itself. Rosalie was still on the porch when June came out of the house. She'd been in her room the whole time, as asked, but she'd clearly been at the window because she said immediately, "Midnight Jack's in the east pasture." "Cully got him, I know." June sat beside her on the step. She didn't ask how it had gone, maybe because she'd seen enough from the window to understand the basic shape of it, or maybe because she was the kind of person who waited to be told things, rather than demanding them. After a minute, she said, "Is it over?" "Part of it," Rosalie said. "The rest is going to take a while, but he left." "He left." June thought about this. "He'll be back." "Maybe. But the next time he comes, there'll be a court proceeding behind us and a marshal who's seen what he does." She looked at her daughter. "He won't come the same way twice." They sat together in the cold for another minute. "Gideon was brave," June said. Rosalie looked out at the yard. Gideon was at the water trough, washing his hands and face with the unhurried efficiency of someone who was still managing an adrenaline he hadn't fully acknowledged. She watched him straighten up and push his wet hair back and look out toward the east pasture where the stallion had gone, and she thought about what it had cost him to stand in that yard and say his name and his father's name out loud in front of a man who had destroyed them both. "Yes," she said. "He was." Monday came and went. The ride to the county seat was long and cold, and the proceeding was less dramatic than the confrontation in the yard, which was how legal things usually worked. Rosalie was learning all the drama in the preparation, and then the actual mechanism of it as dry and procedural as filling out a feed order. She and Gideon sat across from Crane and his clerk for 4 hours, giving statements, producing documents, answering questions. Holt was there with his filing and his professional calm and the particular focused energy of a lawyer who had decided this was the case worth his full attention. When it was over, Crane walked them to their horses. "The injunction application is before the circuit judge in Helena," he said. "I've sent a messenger with my full endorsement. Given the evidence of active fraud and the risk of irreversible harm to the property, which is what an illegal foreclosure would represent, I believe there's a reasonable chance he grants it." "How long?" Rosalie asked. "A week, maybe 10 days. "I have 12 days. Then we're working within the margin." He looked at her without flinching from the difficulty of what he was saying. "I won't promise you it's enough. The law works at its own pace, and its pace isn't always the right one." "I know," she said, "but it's what we have." Gideon said nothing during this exchange. He was looking at the county courthouse across the road, a plain wooden building, 2 stories, with a hand-lettered sign that said Copper Hollow County Territorial Court above the door, and he was looking at it with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not satisfaction. Something more unfinished than that. On the road home, she finally asked, "What are you thinking about?" He glanced at her. They were riding side by side on the empty road, the mountains to the northwest going white with the first real accumulation of high-altitude snow, the creek running below them on the left. My father stood in that building, he said. The proceeding that took his land was held in that building. She looked at the road ahead. And now you just gave testimony in it that may take it back. He was quiet for a moment. It's not the same building. They rebuilt it in '85. Fire. No, she said. But it's the same town, the same county, the same creek. And you're here. He didn't say anything to that. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted slightly, the specific shift of someone who has been carrying a load for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down for a moment without feeling like they're abandoning it. The following days had a different texture than the ones before, still tense, still uncertain, but differently so. The immediate threat had been blunted. Ketter hadn't disappeared. Nobody thought for a minute that he'd disappeared, but he'd retreated to a position behind his lawyers and his money and the slow machinery of the legal system, which was territory where Rosalie had less control, but considerably more support than she'd had 3 weeks ago. She sold 2 more horses, not the chestnuts, which she was holding to a buyer who came to the specifically because Harwick had mentioned Midnight Jack's bloodlines, and she got fair prices because Harwick had mentioned other things too, and the buyer had come with respect rather than opportunism. She put the money in the account with the rest, and she and Holt worked out the math of what it would take to pay down enough of the mortgage that even without the injunction, she could make a credible legal argument against immediate foreclosure. It wasn't $900. It was never going to be $900 in 30 days. But it was enough to fight with. The letter from Helena came on the 8th day. Holt sent his clerk with it rather than a rider, which meant it was long and required explanation, and she sat in Holt's office while he read it aloud in the careful, measured voice he used when the content was significant. The circuit judge had granted a 60-day injunction against any foreclosure proceedings on Red Willow Ranch, pending the outcome of the territorial fraud investigation into Ketter land and cattle holdings. She let out a breath that she had been holding, in one form or another, for almost a month. 60 days, she said. 60 days. Holt set the letter down. It's not over. The fraud investigation has to succeed for this to become permanent. But it buys us time, and it buys us legitimacy. Ketter's lawyers will have a much harder time arguing accelerated action now that a territorial judge has weighed in. And the fraud investigation itself? Helena is taking it seriously. More seriously than I expected, frankly. I think Crane's endorsement carried weight. He paused. The letter also mentions that they've identified 2 other properties in this territory where Ketter's acquisition methods are being reviewed. She looked at him. Other properties, the Alderson land and the Crane homestead. He looked at her over his spectacles. You're not the first, Rosalie. You're just the first. Who fought back hard enough to get the attention of someone with the authority to look at the full picture. She thought about the Aldersons, whoever they were, the Crane family, people she didn't know whose losses had paved the road she was standing on. I want to know if there's anything I can do for them, she said. Testimony, potentially. When the full investigation reaches the proceeding stage, he folded the letter. Right now, go home and sleep. You've been running on empty for a month. She rode home in the gray afternoon and told Gideon before she told anyone else, which she didn't plan. She simply arrived at the yard, and he was the first person she saw, and the words came out immediately. His face did something she hadn't seen on it before. Not relief exactly. Something more like the specific expression of someone who has been walking toward a destination for a very long time and has just caught sight of it on the horizon, still far away, still not arrived, but undeniably there. 60 days, he said. 60 days. He nodded. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. That's enough. It should be. It's enough, he said again, with the particular firmness of someone who has decided something and isn't going to negotiate it. She almost smiled. All right. It's enough. Pete and Cully took the news with the restrained satisfaction of men who had spent 6 weeks staying vigilant without entirely knowing why, and were now told the vigilance had mattered. Cully, who had an opinion about everything, said I knew it with the conviction of someone who had not entirely known it. Pete said nothing but went to the barn and came back with a bottle of something he'd been keeping somewhere and poured 3 cups and handed them out, and that was how Red Willow Ranch observed its first significant victory. June was told at supper. She listened to the full explanation with her fork held still over her plate and then said, So we're keeping the ranch. For now, Rosalie said. The investigation has to play out, but we're keeping it. Rosalie looked at her daughter. We're keeping it. June went back to eating, with the practical satisfaction of someone who had never seriously entertained the alternative. The weeks that followed were the strange, suspended weeks of a situation that is no longer in crisis but has not yet resolved the legal equivalent of winter, Rosalie thought, where everything is stopped and waiting, and you do what maintenance you can, and trust that the ground is still there under the frost. Ketter was quiet. His lawyers filed responses and Helena Holt kept her informed, translating the legal language into plain speech with the patient competence of someone who understood that information was a form of respect, but the responses were the procedural kind, not the aggressive kind. He was playing defense now, and playing it with money and time, the two resources he had most of, but he was playing defense. It changed the quality of the days at Red Willow. Not completely, she still checked the fence lines, still sure someone rode the creek boundary, still kept the lock on the water gate. Habits formed under pressure took time to soften. But the specific bracing quality, the waiting for the next blow, began to ease out of the mornings, and she found she was sleeping through the night again, which she hadn't realized she'd stopped doing until it started again. Gideon settled into the ranch with a thoroughness that she watched with a kind of complicated attention. He wasn't a temporary presence he hadn't been for a while, and they both knew it, but the knowing had been something they carried separately. In November, he'd been the hired hand with the unknown history, and the horse nobody else could manage. By December, he was the person Cully and Pete looked to when something needed a decision, and Rosalie wasn't in the yard. By January, he knew every fence post and water gate and difficult animal on the property, the way you knew things you intended to keep. He and June had their own rhythm by then, the corral work, which had become a daily education in horse handling, that June took as seriously as her schoolwork, and considerably more seriously than arithmetic. And the occasional long silences at the fence rail, where they both watched Midnight Jack move and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Rosalie watched this from whatever distance was available, and told herself she was simply noting that her daughter had a good teacher. One evening in late January, she was at the desk doing the books when Gideon knocked at the back door. She said, "Come in," without getting up, which she'd started doing sometime in December when the back door knock had become so routine that the formality of answering it felt unnecessary. He came in and stood at the edge of the kitchen with a look on his face that was different from the usual back door look, which was practical and purposeful. This one was less certain. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment, which for him was normal, but this was the particular kind of quiet that preceded something rather than following it. "I got a letter today," he said, "from Crane's office." She set her pen down. "The upstream property," he said. "The Rusk land. Crane is recommending to the territorial court that the transfer be voided, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. If the court agrees, the land reverts to its last legitimate owner." He paused. "Which is my father's estate." "Which is me," she looked at him. "They're giving it back. They're recommending it. It's not done yet." He looked at the table. "But Crane thinks it will be done." "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "That's your father's work." "All of it. 18 months he spent on that diversion." She held his eyes. "It's right that it goes back." He nodded slowly. The lamplight was doing what it did in the evenings in her kitchen, making everything warmer than it was, softer at the edges. He looked tired in a different way than usual, not the bone-deep tired of hard work. The tired of something ending that had been going for a long time. "If the land comes back to me," he said carefully, "I'd control the water source for this whole valley." "I know. I don't want to control it," he said. "Not the way Ketter did. Not the way he tried to." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too. I'm thinking about a water access agreement. Permanent access for all the downstream properties written, filed with the county, binding regardless of who owns the land in the future. McCready, Varga, Harwick, all of them." He paused. "I'd want your input on how to write it." She thought about that. "My input. You understand this valley better than I do. You know the people and the properties and the water needs." He looked at her. "And I'd want Red Willow included on fair terms. The upstream land and Red Willow share the creek. They should probably share the agreement." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up and the house talked back to it the way old houses did, settling into the pressure rather than fighting it. Are you thinking about staying? She said. He looked at her. I live here. You work here. It's not the same thing. She kept her voice even, because this was the kind of conversation that went badly if either person reached for more than the words actually said. If you have land of your own, good land, valuable land, your situation is different than it was when you arrived. My situation, he said, with a slight emphasis that she didn't entirely parse. You came here with $20 and a horse nobody wanted. That's not what you have anymore. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp made its small sounds. Somewhere in the house upstairs, June shifted in her sleep. I know what I have, he said finally. The question is what I want. She met his eyes. She had spent a month reading this man across fence lines and kitchen tables and barn doorways, and she was good at it, and what she read now was not complicated. What do you want? She said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had stopped being weathered-looking to her sometime around November and had started being simply his. I'd like to not answer that tonight, he said. If that's all right. She thought about it. All right, because I want to answer it correctly, he said. And I'm not certain I've got the right words yet. She nodded. She understood that entirely. She had the same problem herself and had for a while. Good night, Gideon, she said. Good night, Rosalie. He stood up. The lock on the water gate is holding, by the way. I checked it this afternoon. Thank you. He put on his hat and went out into the January cold, and she sat at the desk for a while without doing the books, listening to the house settle and the wind work at the corners, and the creek running somewhere below in the dark, carrying water where it had always carried it, indifferent to the human arguments about who owned the right to name that fact. The investigation ran its course the way investigations did, slower than anyone wanted and faster than the law usually allowed, which meant it took 3 months from the day Crane first rode through Red Willow's gate to the day the territorial court in Helena issued its findings. She got Holt's summary letter on a Tuesday in late March, when the ground was starting to soften and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and Red Willow was in the specific suspended state of a ranch between winter and work. Everything paused on the edge of the season turning. She read it at the kitchen table. Then she read it again. Then she went outside and found Gideon at the stone corral, where he was almost always to be found in the mornings, and she handed it to him without saying anything first. He read it. He read it slowly, which was how he read everything, and she watched his face, and she saw the moment he reached the part that mattered. There was a stillness, and then something underneath the stillness that he didn't bother to control. He looked up. The fraud finding is complete, she said, because she needed to say it out loud herself. The 1,880 Rusk transfer is voided. The mortgage on Red Willow is voided as part of the same fraudulent scheme. Ketter has been charged with land fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and coercion of property through fraudulent misrepresentation. She took the letter back. He's been arrested in Billings. Gideon leaned on the fence rail and looked out toward the east pasture where Midnight Jack was moving in slow circles. In the morning light, his black coat gone almost amber where the sun hit it. The upstream property, Gideon said, recommended for restitution to the Rusk estate. That's you. She looked at the letter again. There's a note from Crane. He says the Alderson family has filed for restitution of their property. The Crane homestead, too. She paused. He says it's likely there are more cases. That what you started by filing the Briggs affidavit opened a line of inquiry they'd been trying to open for years without the right piece of evidence. I didn't start it, Gideon said. My father started it. He started it by building something worth stealing. She was quiet for a moment. There wasn't anything to add to that. Midnight Jack stopped his circling and turned and looked at them from across the pasture, the way horses sometimes did directly, without the usual flickering attention, as if he was checking on something. What do you do now? Rosalie said. Gideon turned from the fence to look at her. In the March morning light, he looked different than he had in October, not older, but settled in a way he hadn't been then, the way a fence post settles into ground that's had a full winter to close around it. I told you I wanted to answer a question correctly, he said. She looked at him. You did say that. I've had 3 months to find the right words. And? He looked at her with the directness that was simply his nature. The directness she'd come to understand was not bluntness but honesty. The particular honesty of someone who had spent enough time around dishonesty to have decided against it completely. I want to stay, he said. Not as a hired hand, not because the land is here and it's convenient, because this is where I want to be. He held her look. And because the person I want to be near is here. The March wind came across the yard and moved her hair, and she didn't put her hand up to stop it. The water access agreement, she said. He blinked slightly. What about it? I've been thinking about how to write it. The legal language, the boundaries, the terms. She folded Holt's letter and held it against her coat. I thought we might work on it together. It's going to affect both properties. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. It is. So it makes sense to approach it as a shared problem. It does. Tonight, then. After supper. The corner of his mouth moved. Tonight after supper, he said. She turned and walked back toward the house, and she was 3 steps away when she allowed herself a small private expression that she did not turn around to let him see. Because she was Rosalie Danner, and she had her habits, and some of them were worth keeping even now. But she was smiling. The water access agreement took them 3 evenings to write. Not because the legal language was complicated. Holt handled the formal portions, but because every time they sat down at the kitchen table with the papers between them, one of them would raise something the other hadn't considered, and they'd have to work it through before they could move forward. Which upstream tributary counted toward the McCready allocation? Whether the Varga property's expanded grazing plans should change their dry season draw? What happened if a future drought reduced total flow below the minimum guarantees? They argued about 2 of those questions. Real arguments, not the careful diplomatic kind, the kind where someone says you're wrong and means it, and has to be shown why they're wrong before they'll move on. Gideon was wrong about the dry season calculation, and Rosalie told him so with a directness that made him go quiet for a moment, before he looked at her figures again and said, "You're right," without dressing it up. She was wrong about the tributary boundary, and he showed her on the hand-drawn map why her line would create a dispute with the Henderson property in about 10 years when the creek shifted its bank, which creeks did. She looked at it and said, "Fix it," and he fixed it. By the 3rd evening, they had something that held together. Holt reviewed it on Friday, made 4 changes to the language, and filed it with the county recorder on Monday. The Copper Hollow Territorial Creek Access Agreement, which was what the document was officially called, though most people in the valley simply referred to it as the Rusk Agreement, which Gideon learned about secondhand and said nothing about publicly and thought about privately.
In the way you thought about things that were too large to look at directly, was recorded on the 14th of April, 1889.
It guaranteed permanent water access to 11 downstream properties, regardless of upstream ownership, with fair share allocations that adjusted seasonally and a dispute resolution process that required both parties to appear before the county clerk before either could take unilateral action. It was not a perfect document. Nothing written by human beings under the pressure of practical necessity ever was. But it was honest and it was durable, and it meant that what had been used as a weapon for 8 years became instead something that belonged to everyone who depended on it. Frank McCready, when Rosalie rode down to tell him it was filed, stood on his porch and read the copy she handed him, and then stood there a while longer without saying anything. His wife came out, and he handed her the paper, and she read it too, and then she looked at Rosalie with an expression that had nothing performing in it at all. "Tell Gideon we're grateful," she said. "Tell him yourself," Rosalie said. "He'll be at the spring branding. Everyone will." The spring branding was the first real gathering Red Willow had hosted since before Thomas died. Rosalie had not planned it as a celebration, she'd planned it as a practical event because 4 neighboring families had stock to brand, and it was more efficient to do it together, but it became a celebration anyway. The way things sometimes did when people who had been through something difficult were finally in the same place with a reason to eat and talk and stand in the sun. The chestnuts foaled in late April, 3 weeks before the branding, and both foals were healthy, a colt and a filly, black as their sire, with the same quality in their legs and chest that made experienced horsemen stop and look twice. The colt Rosalie had already decided she was keeping. The filly she would sell in the fall when she was weaned, and the price she got for a filly by Midnight Jack would be more than she'd made on the entire horse herd the previous year. This was not the thing that had saved Red Willow, but it was the thing that was going to carry it forward, and she understood the difference. Ketter's trial was held in Helena in June. Rosalie testified. Gideon testified. Maria Varga testified, with her brother beside her in the gallery because she'd asked him to come and he had, which was the kind of simple fact that said more about certain people than any amount of formal description. Ed Harwick testified. Frank McCready testified. Even old Briggs, who had been transported from Garnet Crossing with considerable logistical difficulty, and whose health had declined enough that he gave his testimony seated, with his hand shaking and his voice thinner than it had been in October, testified. The jury took 2 days. Ketter was convicted on 6 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of criminal conspiracy, and 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation of collateral. His lawyers argued for leniency on grounds of age and standing in the community. The judge, who had seen the full scope of what the investigation had uncovered, the Alderson property, the Crane homestead, and 3 smaller parcels that hadn't even been on Rosalie's radar when the whole thing started, was not moved by the argument about standing. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial penitentiary. He never regained the power he'd held. The properties he'd acquired through fraud were subject to ongoing restitution proceedings that tied up his remaining assets for years. Those lawyers who'd known what they were defending eventually found other clients, which was the kind of accountability that didn't make the newspapers but mattered in the long, practical run of things. Rosalie heard the verdict from Holt's letter, sitting at her kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, with the windows open for the first time that year, and the sound of the creek coming in on the warm air. She read the letter twice, then set it down. She didn't feel the triumph she'd expected. What she felt was more complicated and more honest than that, a bone-deep tiredness that had been waiting behind everything else for months, and underneath it, something quieter. Not happiness, exactly. More like the specific sensation of weight you didn't know you were carrying until you put it down. She thought about Thomas, which she did less than she used to, not because she remembered him less clearly, but because grief changed shape over time, and the shape it had taken lately was more like a fact than a wound. He had not been the man who could have done what needed to be done this past year. That wasn't a condemnation. He'd been the man he was, and she'd loved him for it, and he'd given her June and Red Willow and the years they'd had. But the woman who had stood on the porch waiting for Ketter's buggy in the cold March morning was not the woman Thomas had known. And she understood, now that she'd become her over the course of the hardest year of her life, and that she couldn't have become her any other way. She folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer and went outside. Gideon was at the stone corral. Of course he was. Some things had not changed, and she no longer expected them to. He saw her face when she crossed the yard. "Guilty," she said. He nodded once. He turned back to the corral rail for a moment, and she stood beside him, and they didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things she had come to value about his company. The space between words was as honest as the words themselves. "It won't bring your father back," she said finally. No. He looked out at the pasture where Midnight Jack was grazing in the late afternoon sun, older now, a little slower, his black coat carrying a thread of gray at the muzzle that hadn't been there in October. But his name is clear. The county record says what happened. The land says what's true. He paused. "That's not nothing." "It's not nothing," she agreed. June came around the corner of the barn at a flat run, the way she'd been running since she was 3, all elbows and purpose, and skidded to a stop when she saw their faces. "What happened?" she said. "Ketter was convicted," Rosalie said. June absorbed this. "Good," she said, with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a 10-year-old for whom justice was still a thing that could be expressed in a single syllable, and then she turned to Gideon. The colt got out of the east pasture. Gideon straightened up immediately. "Which direction?" "North. Cully's got him, but he won't lead." "He never leads for Cully," Gideon said, already moving. "Cully rushes him." "I know," June said, falling into step beside him. "I told him that." "What did he say?" "He said he'd been working horses since before I was born." She paused. "I said that explained the problem." Gideon glanced at her sideways. "You said that to Cully. He wasn't wrong. He has been working horses since before I was born. The two things can both be true." Gideon looked back at Rosalie over his shoulder with an expression that contained more than one thing at once, and she raised her eyebrows slightly because she recognized the look and knew what was behind it. And he turned back around, before either of them made it into something it didn't need to be yet. They married in October, after the autumn roundup, the same way Rosalie did everything practically, with the work finished first and the celebration earned rather than premature. The ceremony was small because she wanted it that way. In the yard of Red Willow, with the leaves off the cottonwoods and the creek running full and cold in the mountains showing their first snow at the high elevations. June stood beside them. This had not required discussion. It was simply where she stood. Holt was there, and Harwick, and the Macreadys, and the Vargas, and Pete, who had been with the ranch longer than anyone, and who wore his good coat without being asked and said nothing, but shook Gideon's hand afterward, with a grip that communicated a volume of approval that Pete would never have put into words. Cully cried, which surprised everyone, including Cully, and he spent the remainder of the afternoon finding reasons to stand facing away from people. There was food, and there was warmth, and there were things said between people that deserved to be said, and Rosalie moved through all of it with the particular qualities she'd always had present and capable and not performing anything, and she watched her daughter drag Gideon to show him the colt one more time, even though he'd seen the colt that morning, and she thought about the woman who had driven a buckboard 12 miles to a horse auction in October 1888 looking for $20 worth of working stock. That woman had been surviving. She had been good at it. She'd mistaken the skill for the destination. You could spend your whole life being very good at surviving something and mistake the toughness you'd built for the thing itself. Rosalie had done that. She understood it clearly now in the way you only understood things after you'd gotten enough distance from them to see the whole shape. She had closed herself into the work and the worry and the daily machinery of keeping Red Willow breathing, and she had told herself that was enough. Because asking for more than survival, when survival was not guaranteed, seemed like a luxury she hadn't earned. What she hadn't understood was that surviving alone and building together weren't the same weight. That a person could be strong enough to carry everything and still be better off not having to. Gideon had not saved her. That was the part that mattered most, and the part that was easiest to misunderstand. She had held the fence lines and ridden to Holt and brought the neighbors in, and written the letters and stood on her porch in the March cold, and refused the man who thought her beauty and her debt made her something he could acquire. She had done all of that, and she would have kept doing it, one way or another, whatever the cost. But he had stood beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. He had ridden the creek boundary and fixed the diversion gate and found Briggs, and walked into a yard full of hostile witnesses, and said his name out loud when saying, his name cost him something real. He had come to her back door every evening with what he found, and let her decide what to do with it. He had waited until he had the right words. That was its own kind of strength. The kind that didn't announce itself. The years that followed were not easy in the way that only romantic stories made things easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, and calves lost to illness, and arguments about money that got loud enough that June retreated to the barn with a book until they were finished. There was a year when the creek ran so low in August that even with the water agreement, everyone on the valley floor was rationing. And Gideon and Frank Macready and Ed Harwick spent 3 weeks digging an emergency diversion channel together that was brutal work in brutal heat and nearly broke all three of them. There was the spring the barn roof finally gave out entirely and had to be rebuilt from scratch, which took money they didn't have and weeks they couldn't spare, and ended with a structure that was solid but not pretty, and had a slight lean to the east that Pete claimed gave it character. There was a night in the 3rd year when June was 11 and sick with a fever that ran high enough and long enough that Rosalie and Gideon sat up beside her through the dark hours without speaking much, just present, taking turns with the cool cloths and the waiting, which was the only thing available. The fever broke before morning. June woke up annoyed at being fussed over and hungry in the bottomless way of children recovering from illness. And Rosalie went downstairs to make food and stood in her kitchen alone for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of how frightened she'd been, which she hadn't let herself feel while it was happening. Gideon came down 20 minutes later and said nothing. He just made coffee and set a cup beside her, and that was the whole of it. Midnight Jack lived to be 23, which was old for a horse that had run wild for 2 seasons before anyone caught him, and old for the kind of work he'd done at Red Willow in the years between. He slowed gradually the way things slowed, when they had lived fully not all at once, but in small increments that you only noticed when you looked back at where you'd started. In his last years he stood mostly in the south pasture, and June, who who was 17 by then and taller than her mother and possessed of opinions about everything, visited him every morning without fail. When he died, it was peacefully and in the sun, which was the best way things ended. He left behind 12 offspring in the valley, and their offspring after them, and the line he started at Red Willow became known throughout that part of Montana for the specific qualities that had made him impossible to control and irreplaceable once you understood him: the deep chest, the clean legs, the bone-level stubbornness, and the capacity, once trust was earned, to give everything. Copper Hollow remembered the story the way small places remembered the stories that happened on their land, not always accurately, not always fairly, but persistently. There were people who told it wrong. There were people who emphasized the wrong parts, who made Keter into a simple villain rather than the particular kind of patient, institutional evil that was actually harder to fight, because it wore the clothes of legitimate business. There were people who left Gideon out of it entirely, which was its own kind of injustice, and people who left Rosalie's neighbors out of it, which missed the point. But the version that lasted, the one that got passed down through the families of the Creek Valley, that was told at kitchen tables and on fence rails, and at the occasional gathering where people who had known the principles personally corrected the people who hadn't, that version was than the facts and truer than the simplification, the way the best stories were. A woman went to an auction to buy a $20 horse. She paid $40 for a horse and a cowboy. She refused to sell what she'd built. She brought her neighbors together. She found the evidence and held the line and stood on her porch and waited. What the story got right was the core of it, that Rosalie Danner had not been saved by anyone, that she had saved herself in the way that people actually saved themselves, not alone, because nobody actually did it alone, but through the specific courage of refusing to become someone who accepted less than what was true, and that sometimes the best $40 you ever spent wasn't a transaction at all. It was a choice to trust what you saw in someone before you had proof enough to justify it, and to be the kind of person that choice turned out to be right about. Red Willow Ranch stood, the creek ran, the agreement held. The name Rusk, carved into the upstream land grant that Gideon filed with the county recorder in the spring of 1889, stayed carved. And on a certain kind of evening in autumn, when the light came off the mountains at the particular angle that made the whole valley go amber, and the creek caught it and threw it back, Rosalie Danner, Rosalie Rusk, though she answered to both without preference, would stand on the porch of the house she had refused to surrender and feel the specific satisfaction of someone who had built what they were standing on, and knew it, and was still standing. That was the whole of it. That was enough.